Hey guys, I hope you're doing great today. This is our chapter number 19 and today we are going to start with Git. Guys, this is our chapter number 19. So in the last 18 chapters, we have covered what is DevOps, what are the most popular DevOps tools, and what is Linux file system, and I have created a 5 hours course on Linux system. After that, we started with our first DevOps tools, which is Docker. And in Docker, we have covered almost everything regarding Docker, which is suitable for DevOps beginners and DevOps engineers. After that, I have also created a 6 hours video of Docker course in which everything regarding what is Docker, how Docker works, what is a Docker file, how to build, pull and push images, 50 Docker commands, Docker volumes, Docker networking deep dives, and Docker help. And also we have covered some basics of Docker Compose. Now guys, it is time to start with our second DevOps tool, which is Git. So I request you to please subscribe my YouTube channel because we are going to cover all these important DevOps tools one by one. So I'm sure that now you have a clear path that how we are moving along with DevOps tools. We have prepared our base, which is Linux operating system. We have been working on Ubuntu. Now, after that, we are able to work with Linux CLI, and then we ran 70 plus Linux commands. Now, after that, we started our first DevOps tool, which is Docker. Now, it is easy for us to work on Linux CLI, and now it would be really easy to work with all the DevOps tools because on the day one, guys, I told you that it is mandatory to learn Linux to work on all other DevOps tools. So Git also works on Linux and also it works on Windows as well. And the good news is the man who created Linux also created Git. So in this chapter, we are going to cover only what is Git. So let's get started. Guys, we know that it is the responsibility of the developers and the software engineers to write code. And in the IT organizations, we have seen that a lot of developers, multiple software engineers are working on a single project. For instance, a single project can have 10 or 12 or 15 developers working on the same project. Now, how the code of that project is managed? We use Git to manage and track all the files, all the changes happening with that code. So if I am asked what is Git? Okay, define Git. So the simplest and the shortest definition of Git is it is a DevOps tool which is used to track changes in your code. Yes, guys, this is the simplest and the shortest definition of Git. It is a tool to track changes happening in your code. Who is working on which file? Now let us understand Git a little bit more with this diagram. Guys, for instance, this is my project. I am working on an e-commerce solution. This is my project, e-com solution, okay? E-commerce store, you can say. Now there are multiple developers working on this single project. This is developer A, okay? Dev A. This is Dev B. This is another developer, Dev C. For instance, this guy is also a software engineer. I would also use the term software engineers because software engineers, developers are working and writing the code. So they are definitely, every time they are attached with Git and working with the Git repositories. For instance, he is a software engineer and he is also attached or working on the same project with the development team, and he is the guy. D, there is also another person, software engineer, who is working on this project. And so there is, for instance, there is a total team of 5 developers and engineers working on that project, and this team is led by a development manager. Okay, so this guy is a manager, and he is managing all the team, the developers, software engineers who are working on this single project. So if we are not using Git, how can we assume that developer A, what is he working on? How can we know that what is developer B is working on, or software engineer D is working on? So Git simplifies and it helps us to know what are these developers working on using Git, because every developer has a separate branch. So each developer will create a separate branch, and on that branch he or she will write the code, and that code is merged with the master branch. Okay, there should be a master branch which contains the final version of the code, and that master branch is managed or looked by the development manager. So each developer, that's how actually happens in the IT teams. A developer, the team of developers write the code in their branches. When that code is properly tested and that feature is tested by the QA team, then that branch, so for instance this is branch A, B, C and respectively, and the guys will tell that the code is ready and it can be merged with the master branch. We will study about the branching strategy in Git and why it is necessary to create branches for the code. But for now, you need to understand that this is my project and this is the team members of the development and software engineering team. So they are working on a single project, and Git is helping them to avoid conflicts, because each developer and the software engineer is writing the code. So in order to avoid the conflicts, they will create separate branches, and those branches are merged with the master branch after testing and verifying the code is working fine. So we can say that Git is the most popular version control system which tracks the changes happening with the code, because each developer is definitely writing the code and making some changes on that project. So Git is actually tracking the files and changes happening with the code. And not only that, guys, Git also maintains the previous versions of the code. For instance, I have written that code, but for some reason that code is not working on a specific branch. With the help of Git, since Git maintains the versions of the code, I can bring any copy of the previous code and I can start working on that piece of code right away. So that is why Git is known as the version control software, because we can have multiple versions of our code. Now guys, there is another term that is mostly used in Git, which is distributed version control system, because Git is actually a distributed version control. I should have told you that in the first place, but I wanted you to clear the concept of the version control, the software version control. And there are actually two types of version control: the centralized version control and the distributed version control. Centralized version control. And now distributed version control is used, and there are a lot of benefits of distributed version control as compared to the centralized version control. So actually there are two types of version controls: centralized and distributed. So what is centralized version control? As the name says, that centralized version control, in this approach, the project is located at a single location. It means that we have the only one copy of the project, and all the developers and software engineers access that location, that project copy to work and write the code. Whereas in distributed version control, we can have the full and fledged multiple copies of the project on multiple computer systems. So distributed version control gives us a broader access of our code. Now let's compare both version controls with a diagram. My fellas, it is mandatory to have the concepts cleared regarding centralized and distributed version control. However, since we are working with Git because it is a distributed version control, but still we need to understand the concept and the difference between each version control. So in centralized, this is centralized, okay, version control, and the example is SVN, subversioning, SVN, okay. And in centralized version control, we have only one copy of the code, and this is, for instance, my repo, okay, code, and I have the only one copy of that code on a single server, and multiple developers are working on that code from their computers. This is PC1, this is PC2, and this is PC3, okay. But the problem is that they are writing the code which is stored in a single centralized location. We don't have the multiple copies of our project, of our repository, or of our code on multiple locations. The location is one. The location is centralized, and the developers access that location, access that code from their personal computers, from their PCs, to write and make some changes. And that's why this approach is known as centralized version control. Now let's discuss distributed version control approach. In the distributed version control, like Git is the best example of distributed version control. We have this repository, or our code, or our project repo code, and we will have the multiple copies of that code, okay. This is another copy, full-fledged copy of our repository. This is another copy, and this is another copy. And now the developers are working on that code. They have the full copy of the code on their personal computers. This is also the repo, and this is the copy of the repo, this main repo, and this is also the copy of the repository. So in centralized, we just had only one copy of the code, but in distributed version control, we can have the multiple same copies of our main repository or main code, and all these repositories can be accessed from different working personal computers or desktop systems. This is PC1, this is PC2, and this is PC3. So that is the difference between centralized and distributed version control. In centralized, we had only one copy of the repository or code, and multiple developers are working on that code, and they are accessing only one central location. But in distributed version control, there can be multiple copies of the repository or our code, and each developer can have that full project on her or his PC. I hope that now you understand the difference between centralized and distributed version control. The example of centralized version control is SVN, subversion control, and the best example and our favorite version control is Git, which is distributed version control. And using this version control, we can have the full copy or the full code repository on our personal computers, on our PCs, on our desktop systems. Now let's discuss some beautiful facts of Git. Git was actually introduced by Linus Torvalds, the person who gifted us Linux. And also, he is the creator of this version control, which is Git. Now, guys, there are around 95% of the developers working on the whole world are relying on Git for their code. And the beauty of the Git is we can have this single project. This is my project, and I can have thousands of branches. These are branches of that single project using Git. So it means that hundreds or thousands of developers can work along a single project using branches, and it is easily and linearly handled by Git. I was searching about Git on Google and I found a really interesting question. So I thought that I should share it with you guys. What is the difference between Git and GitHub? Are they same? No. Git is a version control software which we can install on our personal computer. Okay, this is my personal computer and I can install, because Git is open source, it is free, and I can install it on my personal computer and I can manage or write my code. But GitHub is a service which runs Git in the cloud. This is cloud, and in GitHub, Git runs in the cloud. So we can say that we can install Git on our personal computer. It is a version control software, whereas GitHub is a cloud service which runs Git on the cloud. Git is a free software, whereas we have to pay for using the GitHub online services, and there are packages on github.com. So guys, I'm sure that whenever you're asked about the difference between Git and GitHub, you can answer that Git is a free version control and we can install and we can work on our personal computer, whereas GitHub is a Git service in the cloud. Alright guys, now let's wind up this lecture. We have discussed the basic concepts of Git. Git is a version control system which helps to track the changes happening in our code. We also discussed the two main types of version control: centralized version control and distributed version control. Since we know that there are a lot of benefits of distributed version control, where we can have multiple copies of our code, multiple copies of our project on different locations, whereas it is not possible in centralized version control, where we have only one copy or single location where our project is located. There are a lot of benefits of distributed version control. That's why 95% of the developers around the world now use Git. And you saw that we can have multiple developers, multiple software engineers. They are working on a single project at the same time without any conflicts. So that is the beauty of Git. And another big thing that I like the most related to Git is it is open source. It was developed by Linus Torvalds, who is the creator of Linux operating system. So this would be open source and free for the rest of our lives. And also we discussed about the difference between Git and GitHub. Git is a version control and we can install it on our personal computers, whereas GitHub is a cloud service where we can work on Git in the cloud. And guys, don't worry, we can work on GitHub for free. We are going to use GitHub in our next lecture. So in the upcoming lecture, we are going to discuss about a couple of Git terminologies, like what is a repository, what does clone mean, and also we will see how Git works. So the second chapter is also one of the important chapters. Make sure that you go through this chapter and have your basic concepts of Git cleared. I will see you in the next lecture, where we are going to discuss how Git works. So make sure to subscribe my channel. I will see you in the next video.